Rancher lived alone for years until the Bigfoot led him to a hidden cave. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The wind swept hard across the Montana prairie, carrying with it the lonely wail of a far-off harmonica, tangled in the slow, steady rhythm of hoofbeats on dry earth. Red dust rose with each step, drifting along the narrow trail that wound toward a solitary ranch tucked against the foot of the mountains. By late afternoon, as the sun kissed the ridge, the fog began to creep down, thick cold curling around the tall pines. And that's when he saw it. A massive figure stepping out of the mist, standing motionless at the forest's edge. His hand tightened on the rifle breath, heavy in his chest, but the creature didn't charge. It only stood there watching, its eyes deep and unreadable. Then, slowly, it turned away, glancing back now and then, as if to say, "Follow me." And in that moment, curiosity began to swallow the fear, pulling him toward a path no one had ever spoken of, and into a story no one would dare believe. Everything began with a single hesitant step. On the Montana high plains, where the wind can sting your face and dry grass runs unbroken to the horizon, there's a small ranch tucked in the mountain's shadow. It belongs to Eli Turner, 52, a man long accustomed to silence and the dusty sprawl of open fields. His days begin with the creak of the barn door, the smell of wood smoke mingling with the chill of dawn, and end beneath the flicker of a lone oil lamp in the window. For years, Eli has lived alone, his family lost to a brutal winter left, with nothing but an old horse, a hunting rifle, and eyes that never stop searching the horizon as if waiting for something that's never come. That day, while checking his traps along a narrow creek, Eli froze. Right there, pressed deep into the damp mud, was a footprint, massive, twice the size of any man's. It trailed off into the pines, fading like the memory of something that had paused to watch him before moving on. A chill worked its way down his spine. It wasn't pure fear, more like the unsettling certainty of being seen. And in that moment, Eli knew this autumn would be unlike any other he'd ever known. Part 1. The First Encounter. The late-day wind swept across the Montana grasslands, carrying a veil of fine red dust along the weathered fence line. In the distance, cattle bawled and bunched together as a hawk skimmed low over the pasture. Eli Turner leaned against a porch post, his thumb brushing the brim of his hat, eyes fixed on the edge of the pine forest where pale gold light tangled with silver strands of mist. Somewhere more than 10 miles out, the sound of a rifle cracked through the air. Maybe hunters, maybe townsfolk target shooting. Out here, the report of a gun was like the toll of a church bell, announcing nothing more than the passing of another day. Eli slung his Winchester over his shoulder and stepped off the porch. Today's task was to check the traps he'd set near the forest's edge. Each footfall crushed the dry leaves beneath him, the wind and the rustle of grass merging into a lonely rhythm he'd walked to for years. But today, that rhythm was broken. There was a strange gap in the sound, an absence so complete it swallowed the world. No birdsong, no squirrel chatter, only the cold wind and the tread of his own boots. When he reached the narrow creek, Eli stopped cold. Pressed into the damp mud at the water's edge was a footprint, massive, nearly 2 handspans long, broad as a shovel blade, the heel and toes etched deep. He crouched, tracing the edge with his fingertip. Water still pooled in the depression, meaning it had been made not long ago. Stories from old-timers flickered in his mind of a giant in the forest, broad as 2 men, black-haired eyes glowing like coals. Eli didn't believe in campfire monsters, but he believed in sign. And this track was real enough to hold him there for a long moment before his hand drifted instinctively toward his rifle. A dry branch snapped across the creek. Eli looked up. Through the thick mist, a towering shape emerged, straight-backed, wide-shouldered, its breath spilling in clouds against the cold. Fading light spilled in narrow beams through the pines, catching on the creature's dark, rough coat. Eli raised the rifle, his frontier instincts flaring. But the Bigfoot didn't bolt. It didn't roar, didn't rush him. It simply stared, its gaze holding no hostility, no fear, only something unreadable, as if weighing a choice. A sudden gust tore through the trees, scattering gold leaves across Eli's boots. His grip tightened on the trigger, but deep inside, a different feeling stirred something that didn't match the stories of savage beasts told in town. Then slowly the Bigfoot turned. It took several long strides into the timber, then glanced over its shoulder, and in that instant Eli understood. It was waiting for him. Every instinct screamed this could be a trap, but curiosity began to swallow the caution. Lowering the rifle, he stepped down the bank. The creek water bit into his legs through the denim, each step sounding with the soft slap of wet cloth. On the far bank, the Bigfoot moved ahead again, pausing just long enough to keep him in sight. No sound, no signal, but the meaning was clear. Follow me. Out here, Western stories rarely began with an unspoken invitation, but this one did. They moved in tandem. Bigfoot in front, Eli a measured 10 paces behind. The leaves crackled under Eli's boots, while the giant's steps were near soundless. The gold light of evening faded to thin threads between the trees. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of pine sap and damp moss. Eli knew one squeeze of the trigger, and he could drop the creature if he chose. But a part of him, the part shaped by years of solitude, felt this was no time to shoot. They pressed deeper into a stretch of forest Eli had never walked before, and with each step, one thought kept circling in his mind. If I keep going, will I find a secret? Or something far worse? What about you? Would you have stepped forward? Part 2. The Silent Invitation. The forest swallowed the last threads of golden light, leaving behind a haze of shifting shadows. The trail Bigfoot led Eli along was so narrow the walls of leaves and knotted roots pressed close on either side. Dry leaves carpeted the ground, brittle enough to crackle sharply under every step of Eli's boots. From far out on the open range, the faint echo of gunfire drifted in thin and distant like a bugle call from another world. A world of dust storms, scattered cattle, and hard-eyed men staring at each other through curls of cigarette smoke. But here, deep among the pines, that world felt centuries away. The Bigfoot moved ahead in long, steady strides, never too fast for Eli to keep pace. And whenever the gap between them stretched beyond 10 paces, it would turn and look back, its dark eyes catching the dim slivers of light still filtering through the canopy. Eli couldn't tell if this was a lure or a true invitation. Yet with each step, the weight of the path deepened in his mind. Once he'd gone far enough, there would be no going back to the way things were. Half an hour in, they reached a fallen log, thick as a horse's body. The Bigfoot stopped, turned toward him, and for the first time since they met, made a deliberate gesture. It raised one massive hand palm outward. Stop. Eli froze his own hand, resting near the Winchester's stock. The creature stooped, picked up a dry branch, and scraped a long line in the earth, tracing it toward a moss-covered boulder. Then it dropped the stick and moved on, glancing back again. Eli understood this wasn't random. It was marking the path like a seasoned trail guide. In his life, he'd tracked stray cattle through dust storms, hunted down a wolf that had taken 3 calves in one night. But no one had ever led him like this, without a word, without a shout, only silence and the faint signs left behind. The ground began to slope upward, the terrain breaking into jagged rock faces and deep, leaf-choked gullies. Now and then, Eli spotted long, high scratches scored into the bark well above any man's reach, like something powerful had raked its claws there long ago. Wind moaned through the narrow cuts in the stone, the sound like the far-off wail of the open plains. It brought back nights in camp when dust storms ripped the tents. Horses screamed in terror, and men wrapped scarves over their faces, eyes narrowed against the sting. This wind felt the same, but not to push him onward, to hold him here. The Bigfoot halted beneath a cliff face, its shadow stretching over the forest floor. It pointed upward toward a narrow opening in the rock, just wide enough for a man to slip through. No words, no urging, just a single measured gesture like asking, "Do you dare?" Eli stepped closer until only 5 paces lay between them. For the first time, he caught the creature's breath heavy deep, carrying the scent of damp earth and old wood smoke. Part of him wanted to turn back to return to his worn table and the comfort of a plain supper, but another part wanted to see what lay ahead. The Bigfoot tilted its head, rotating its massive wrist in a slow motion that said, "Go on." It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Eli gave a small nod and moved past it. When their shoulders aligned, he felt the creature's presence, strong, solid, but not threatening, like an old warhorse among the herd, needing no noise to prove its place. The trail thinned, then vanished, leaving only a gap between two slabs of stone tangled with roots. Light speared down through the opening in narrow beams, catching in the Bigfoot's eyes until they gleamed like pieces of burning amber. It stepped aside, making room for Eli to go first. And deep down, Eli knew this was the moment of no return. Like a cowboy nudging his horse through a strange town's gate, certain trouble waited ahead, yet unwilling to stop. His hand settled on the rifle's stock. He drew in a long breath and stepped into the cleft. Behind him, the Bigfoot followed without a sound, and he wondered, was what lay in the dark ahead a gift, or the last warning he'd ever get if a legendary creature invited you deeper into its territory? Would you cross that threshold? Part 3. The Hidden Cave. Eli stopped short when the rock wall loomed before him in the mist. Thick curtains of vine and moss hung heavy over it, swaying slightly in the breeze like the faded saloon drapes in a frontier town when someone pushes through the door. Far-off gunfire echoed again from the open range, but now it felt more like a memory, reminding him of sandstorms sweeping through town, men narrowing their eyes at each other through a haze of gray smoke. Here in the forest, the only eyes on him belonged to the Bigfoot. It glanced at him once, then turned toward the green-draped wall. The creature stepped up to the cliff, its massive hands pressing against a moss-covered boulder. A low, resonant grind rumbled as it shoved the stone aside. Clumps of earth and moss tumbled down like dust shaken from time itself, revealing a hollow of absolute darkness. Cold air drifted out, smelling of ancient stone and deep earth. Eli felt as if he were standing at the threshold of another world, one no man had walked in living memory. In his life, he'd stepped into dangerous places, a stable in the middle of a storm, a saloon thick with strangers, a valley where wolves hunted close. But never a place that set his pulse hammering quite like this. The Bigfoot stepped aside, turning its massive wrist in a silent gesture, "Look inside." No words yet, its gaze said enough. "Go in." Eli laid his palm against the edge of the opening, feeling the damp, spongy moss cling to his skin. He ducked under and stepped through his shoulder, brushing the cold rock. Light from the forest outside bled away in moments, leaving only a faint golden spill behind him to guide the first few steps. The ground underfoot was soft and fine as ash, each step crunching faintly. The scent of wet stone mingled with the pine resin still clinging to his coat, a mix at once strange and familiar. Behind him, the Bigfoot stooped low to enter its massive frame, nearly filling the doorway. Eli could hear its slow, even breathing, deep and steady like the old pump at the ranch, powerful, patient, enduring. As his eyes adjusted, shapes emerged on the ceiling above lines of red ochre, yellow clay, and soot black. Rough figures of men, beasts, and symbols he couldn't name. Some were faded nearly away, blurred by what must have been hundreds of winters. Eli stared upward so long he forgot to walk. As a boy, he'd heard the old-timers speak of caves where the first people had lived, but he'd never believed he'd see one not like this, and not with a guide the townsfolk called a monster. Somewhere deeper inside, water dripped at steady intervals, each echo long and hollow. Eli's hand found a carving cut deep into the stone, its chill running up his arm. In that instant, he knew he was standing inside a story older than the West itself. The Bigfoot moved ahead, lifting one massive arm to point into the black beyond. Its eyes followed him, not forcing but willing him forward. Out there, the West still rattled with gunshots, kicked up dust, scattered herds, and the wary stares of strangers. But here there was only him, the creature, and an open door into the unknown. Eli drew in a breath, his fingers tightening around the rifle stock, and the question rose in him like a whisper he couldn't silence. If I go deeper, will this be the greatest discovery of my life or my last mistake? And you, if a creature like Bigfoot opened a hidden cave no one knew existed, would you step through? Part 4. The secret in the dark. The darkness swallowed everything behind Eli until a faint glimmer of gold stirred deeper in the cave. The Bigfoot bent, lifting a half-burnt torch from the ground, then struck flint against stone. Sparks jumped, catching on the charred wood until a small flame breathed to life, sending thin smoke curling toward the ceiling. This wasn't the blinding noon light of the west, nor the restless flicker of an oil lamp in a saloon. It was a warm, steady glow, the kind that offered the fragile comfort of a cowboy finding shelter from a dust storm in the middle of nowhere. The Bigfoot held the torch high, casting light across mottled stone walls. Hanging from leather thongs at about Eli's shoulder height were dozens of objects, their shapes strange in the shifting firelight. He stepped closer, eyes sweeping over each one, flint arrowheads, a dagger worn to a dull edge, bone bracelets, and thin hides etched with symbols he didn't recognize. His fingers found the hilt of a wood-handled knife, its grip darkened with age. The blade dulled, yet carved into the handle was a mark that froze him in place. A small, six-pointed star inside a thin circle identical to the mark his father had carved into the stock of his hunting rifle. His father, who had vanished nearly 20 years ago on a hunting trip in these very mountains. He'd disappeared along with several belongings, none of which had ever been found. Eli's gaze drifted left and his chest tightened. On a narrow stone shelf between two rounded rocks sat a small wooden box, its surface darkened with time, the lid crudely carved with the outline of a horse. That carving? He knew it. His father's work. He lifted the box. A thick coat of dust fell away beneath his fingers. When the lid creaked open, a folded handkerchief lay inside. The fabric was yellowed with age, but the stitched initials were still clear. E.T. Eli Turner. He remembered the day his father gave it to him at age 10, and the day he'd taken it back when Eli joined the army, promising to return it when his boy came home. But his father never came back. And now the handkerchief was here in the depths of a cave, delivered by a creature out of legend. Eli stood at the knife's edge of two worlds. On one side, the truth he'd sought for 2 decades. On the other, the dark that might hold more than he was ready to face. The steady drip of water was broken by another sound, a deep, rolling growl low enough to vibrate through the stone. Eli's head snapped up. In the reach just beyond the torchlight, 2 golden eyes flared to life. Not the Bigfoot's eyes, these were smaller, sharper, moving with a slow, deliberate watchfulness. Every instinct in Eli bristled. His hand closed on the Winchester's stock. The Bigfoot stepped forward, planting itself between Eli and the unseen thing, making no sound, offering no roar, only holding a firm, solid stance. For a long moment, the two creatures studied each other across the wavering light like rival sentinels negotiating without words. The air was tight, brittle. One wrong move could turn this cave into Eli's grave. Then, with a slow blink, the golden eyes slipped back into the black swallowed hole. No footstep, no whisper. Only the wind sighing through some high crack in the rock. The Bigfoot lowered the torch and motioned Eli back toward the cave mouth. Eli turned, but his eyes kept straying to that darkness where the other presence had been. He knew he'd seen something no one in a frontier saloon would believe. Outside the opening, he gripped the wooden box tight, the handkerchief inside feeling far heavier than its weight. One question pulsed hard in his mind, unanswered. Why had the Bigfoot returned his father's keepsake? And what still lived in that deeper dark? If you stood there, would you step further into the black or walk away? Part 5. The Real Reason. When Eli and the Bigfoot stepped out of the cave's mouth, the gray light of late autumn poured in, forcing him to squint. A cold wind came down off the ridge, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the grit of stone dust. Somewhere far out on the plains, rifle fire echoed back a reminder that the world beyond still turned, with dust storms scattered herds and hard stares traded over whiskey in frontier saloons. Eli stood at the threshold, the small wooden box gripped tight in his hands, feeling every familiar grain of its surface. For 20 years he'd searched for a trace of his father, and now a creature out of legend had placed it in his hands. The Bigfoot stood beside him, towering silent. Wind rushed through the gap in the rocks, making the vines tremble like faded banners. Eli turned toward it, searching for some explanation, but found only a deep, steady gaze and a strange, quiet peace. It struck him then, through all of this, the Bigfoot had never tried to harm him. No chase, no threat. Every movement, every gesture, every turn of its head had led him to this one thing, the box. This wasn't the work of an enemy. This was a messenger. The Bigfoot moved toward the forest's edge. At a small clearing, it stopped and faced him again. Their eyes met, unbroken by words. In that look, Eli saw more than strength. He saw a sorrow he couldn't name. The kind of sorrow born from witnessing too much and choosing to carry it in silence. The wind swept across the prairie below, just as it had on the days Eli had stood alone on his ranch during a dust storm, everything swirling chaos in every direction, yet a single unmoving point holding fast. Today, that still point was this meeting. The Bigfoot didn't move on, nor did it glance back. It only tipped its head once, then turned away, vanishing into the tree line as though it had never existed. Eli retraced the trail they had come, the long scrape in the dirt, the moss-covered stone, the fallen log. Each mark now felt like a message, its purpose complete. When he stepped out of the timber, the prairie opened wide before him. In the distance, hoofbeats drummed, gunfire from the town popped faintly, and cattle scattered in a sudden gust. All of it familiar, yet changed. What he carried wasn't just a keepsake. It was proof that some stories in the West, though no one believes them, are as real as the quiet stream running under frozen ground. Back at the ranch, Eli set the wooden box on the kitchen table. The oil lamp's glow breathed over the old wood, making it seem alive. He sat down, resting his hand on the lid, and finally understood the Bigfoot hadn't simply returned something his father once owned. It had returned a memory. Maybe his father had saved it once. Maybe they'd shared a story Eli would never fully know. But what mattered was, the Bigfoot had trusted him enough to give it back. Outside the window, the wind kept moving, and the dark wall of the forest seemed to wait. Eli knew if that massive shape ever appeared again, he'd be ready to follow. And you, if a creature out of legend led you to your family's greatest secret, would you trust it? Final chapter. The Promise in the Shadows. The oil lamp on the kitchen table cast a warm halo over the wooden box, its glow tracing every scratch worn smooth by time. Eli sat there with one hand resting gently on the lid, feeling almost that his father was close. Maybe just beyond the window in that stretch of dark timber clinging to the mountain's base. Through the frame of glass, the black mass of the forest seemed to shift and breathe. Pines swayed in the wind, whispering stories no man had ever fully heard. Deep inside, Eli knew today's meeting wasn't an ending. It was the start of something else. A new trail set in motion by a friend he never thought he'd meet. A sudden gust slipped through the cracks, making the lamp's flame bend and dance. Eli looked up, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw a towering figure at the edge of the trees. Before it faded back into the fog, he smiled faintly, exhaling like a man who'd just heard a promise without words. Some journeys begin with the friend you least expect. If a creature out of legend led you to a secret, would you follow? Share your thoughts. If you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.